Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Caleb Schwab? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. This case involves a ride that was at a water park called Schlitterbahn in Kansas City, Kansas. Schlitterbahn is a chain of water parks which was started by the Henry family. The word Schlitterbahn roughly means slippery road in German. The first park was opened in New Braunfels, Texas in 1979. 3 more water parks were opened in Texas, and 1 was opened in Kansas City, Kansas. That park opened in 2009. One of the co-owners of Schlitterbahn, Jeff Henry, was instrumental in designing many of the rides featured in the water parks. Sometime around 2012, producers from the TV series Extreme Water Parks on the Travel Channel approached Jeff and said they were looking for an episode to start the new season. Jeff told them that he was going to build the world's tallest and fastest water slide at the Kansas City location. Eventually, Jeff named the ride Verrückt. This is a German word that means insane. At this point, the Verrückt ride was just an idea. It had not been designed yet. Jeff continued to promote the ride to media outlets, referring to it as, quote, an erotic piece of art, unquote. He also claimed it would go down in history as, quote, the most terrifying ride ever built in a water park, unquote. Unfortunately, Jeff was definitely not lying about that last claim. Jeff was assisted by a designer named John Schooley, but neither of the men had any credentials in engineering. The men used the services of engineers and architects as part of the design process in order to compensate for their lack of knowledge. Despite using some qualified people, Jeff continued to rely largely on a trial and error method to design and test the ride. As part of the design and testing process for the Verrückt ride, he constructed a 1/12 scale model. Jeff used watermelons and cantaloupes as passengers to test the safety of a model car as it went down the slide. After more experiments, a 90-foot model water slide was constructed. The raft was dropped from the top of the ride, then went up a little hill before making a second drop at the end of the ride. Sandbags were used as passengers on the rafts, but the rafts kept flying into the air after reaching the top of the second hill. Once this problem was fixed, the full-size ride was constructed in Kansas City. The Verrückt ride was 168 feet and 7 inches tall and retained the design of having a large initial drop and a smaller second hill. Initially, the test runs showed that the rafts were still lifting off the chute. Eventually, the second hill was raised 5 feet to compensate. After several test runs with sandbags produced what appeared to be safe results, the ride was opened to the public in July of 2014. In its final design, the rubber raft reached speeds of up to 68 miles per hour on the main drop, then climbed 55 feet into the air on the second hill before the ride ended in a run-out pool. The entire trip took about 18 seconds. Each 100-pound raft held 3 passengers, who were positioned one in front of another. According to Jeff and John, the total weight of the 3 passengers needed to be between 400 and 550 pounds in order for the ride to be safe. Passengers were weighed twice before being sent down the chute in the raft. Due to concerns about passengers flying out of the raft, metal hoops with netting were installed. Now moving to the timeline of the incident. On August 7, 2016, 10-year-old Caleb Schwab visited the Schlitterbahn Water Park in Kansas City, Kansas. He was there with his father Scott, his mother Michelle, and his 3 brothers. The family lived in Olathe, Kansas. This particular day was selected to visit the park because the park was offering free admission to Kansas elected officials and their families. Scott's father was a Kansas state representative. Caleb was excited to get on the Verrückt ride as it was the main attraction at the park. He qualified as a passenger by 5 inches. He was 4'11", and the cutoff was 4'6". At about 2:30 p.m., an employee of the park positioned 74-pound Caleb in the front seat of the raft. Behind him were two sisters. They were substantially heavier than Caleb. One was 275 pounds, and the other was 197 pounds. The total weight of the passengers was just 4 pounds under the 550-pound limit for the raft. After the raft was released from the top of the ride, it slid down to the bottom of the chute and then moved up the second hill. Unfortunately, after reaching the top of the hill, the raft flew into the air. Caleb collided with one of the metal hoops, which was holding the netting above the slide. This hoop decapitated him. Both his body and his head exited the raft and landed on the chute. The two female passengers suffered facial injuries, but survived. Witnesses waiting at the bottom of the ride started to scream. One person would later describe it as a nightmare beyond comprehension. After the disaster, a Schlitterbahn spokesperson said, "We honestly don't know what happened." In early 2017, Schlitterbahn paid Caleb's family a $20 million settlement, but civil liability was only part of the problem facing the water park. Law enforcement launched a criminal investigation into the fatality. Here's what they found during the course of their investigation. Schlitterbahn employees were required to submit regular reports about the rides. These reports contained incidents that were never revealed to the public. For example, between August 31, 2014 and August 5, 2016, 11 customers had been injured on the Veru ride. People had injuries to areas like the neck, head, back, and feet. 5 of these injuries involved passengers who claimed that their rafts went airborne at the top of the second hill. One 46-year-old customer named Norris indicated his head hit the metal hoop and the netting. This occurred less than 2 months before Caleb was killed. A lifeguard told the authorities that the director of operations, a man named Tyler Miles, told him to downplay the incident reported by Norris. An engineering firm tested the ride a week before it opened. They determined that if the combined weight of the 3 passengers was between 400 and 550 pounds, the raft could go airborne on the second hill. This weight range was the range that Jeff and John specified as being appropriate. On March 23, 2018, a grand jury indicted Schlitterbahn and the former director of operations, Tyler Miles. The charges included involuntary manslaughter, aggravated battery, aggravated endangerment of a child, and interference with law enforcement. 3 days later, on March 26, Jeff Henry was arrested. He was eventually charged with several crimes, including second-degree murder. His designer, John Schuley, was also charged. The government claimed that Jeff and John lacked the technical expertise to design a properly functioning water slide. The men did not perform standard engineering calculations on how the ride would operate. Rather, they were dependent on trial and error methods. The state asserted that the men had created a deadly weapon. On February 22, 2019, all the charges against Jeff, John, and Tyler were dismissed. The court ruled that the grand jury had been presented with inadmissible evidence, namely the extreme water parks episode featuring the Veru ride. The government decided not to pursue charges with a new grand jury. By the time the charges were dismissed, the Veru ride had already been dismantled. The reputation of Schlitterbahn had been permanently damaged. 2 of their Texas water parks were sold to another company in June of 2019. Now moving to my analysis. Despite the dismissal of the charges, many people believe that the Schlitterbahn workers who were charged were guilty of a crime in connection with Caleb's death. Specifically, there was a lot of animosity directed at Jeff Henry. After all, he was a co-owner of Schlitterbahn and the inventor of the lethal ride. This brings me to the question, was Jeff guilty of murder or any other crime in this case? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. The ride that Jeff designed and constructed killed 10-year-old Caleb Schwab. The ride was being operated according to the rules of the water park, and Caleb was in compliance with those rules. In the time leading up to the fatality, the ride was involved in 11 incidents resulting in injury. Jeff had a criminal and drug use history. In 1994, he was convicted of third-degree felony drug possession after being caught with 17 ounces of marijuana. In 2007, he was convicted on a misdemeanor charge of possession. Jeff made statements during the filming of the Extreme Water Parks episode that made him appear callous and reckless. For example, he said, quote, "Veru could hurt me. It could kill me. It is a seriously dangerous piece of equipment today because there are things that we don't know about it. If we mess up, it could be the end. I could die going down this ride," unquote. Jeff rushed the construction of the project in order to break a record. He wanted to have the tallest water slide in the world. He did not have any credentials in engineering and should have known that he was unqualified to design water park rides. Jeff appeared to ignore the advice of an engineering firm who advised him that the ride was unsafe. Moving to the exculpatory factors, even though Jeff did not have any credentials in engineering, he did have qualified engineers and architects assist him in the design of the ride. Jeff did not break any laws as far as the inspection of the ride because self-inspection was permitted for water parks in Kansas at that time. The law changed after Caleb was killed. As far as the 11 incidents on the ride involving injuries, Jeff told the media that he didn't know about them before Caleb's death. Just about every ride in water parks has been associated with injuries at some point. It is simply the nature of running this type of business. When Jeff made the statements about how the ride could be deadly, he may have just been showing off for the TV show because he wanted to promote the ride. Jeff said, quote, "The real Jeff Henry was not indicted. The actor Jeff Henry, who was trying to glamorize the ride, was indicted," unquote. When considering all the evidence, do I think that Jeff Henry was guilty of any crime in this case? Yes, in my opinion, he was probably guilty of negligent homicide in reality. I'm surprised the state of Kansas did not pursue another indictment. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Jeff Henry was an impulsive and irresponsible high sensation seeker who wanted to break a record by building the world's tallest water slide. He did not have any formal training in engineering, but was not going to let being dangerously unqualified stop him from pursuing his dream. During the testing process, Jeff was callous in the way he viewed the repeated failures of the ride. He did not have a respect for safety. To him, it was all a game. Jeff did use engineers and architects to help with the project, but he ignored at least some of the advice they offered, including a warning about how the ride was unsafe. Knowing the raft could lift from the chute, Jeff had hoops and nets installed. One of these metal hoops would eventually cause the fatality. Jeff rushed the construction of the ride and then created a culture at Schlitterbahn where employees felt pressured to conceal reports of injuries. Now moving to my final thoughts. Around the time this tragedy occurred, visitors to Schlitterbahn, Kansas City, probably believed that the state government was monitoring the operation of the water park. They thought that the rides were safe, but as it turns out, Kansas was allowing the water park industry to regulate itself. This is always a recipe for disaster because there will always be people like Jeff Henry. The state did not have the will to set safety as a priority, and they did not have the will to prosecute after a setback in court. They failed Caleb in every imaginable way. Those are my thoughts in the case of Caleb Schwab. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.